June 1944. Somewhere in a Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadron outside Caen, a photo interpreter is developing film. His unit has been flying modified Messerschmitt Bf 109s over the Normandy beachhead for 3 days, ducking Allied fighters, running cameras at low altitude over the hedgerows and the coastline. He is developing a set of frames taken that morning over a stretch of farmland behind Omaha Beach, near the village of Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. 3 days earlier, on the morning of June 6, the same coordinates had been photographed. Those photographs showed exactly what the Luftwaffe expected to see. Norman pasture land, a few stone farmhouses, hedgerows, cattle, nothing. The photographs developing in front of him now show something else entirely. Where the cattle had been standing 72 hours earlier, there is a runway. A functioning, operational runway, 35 meters wide and roughly 1,000 meters long, with P-47 Thunderbolts parked along its edges and fuel trucks moving on access roads that did not exist on Monday. There are revetments. There is a control point. There are men in olive drab uniforms directing traffic on a road that was clearly a farm track 3 days before. The interpreter holds the wet print under the light and looks at it for a long time. Then he hands it to the officer standing behind him and says something that Luftwaffe photo interpreters in 3 other reconnaissance squadrons along the Normandy front are saying that same week, in almost exactly the same words. He says, "That is not possible." The intelligence officer takes the photograph. He compares it to the sortie from June 6. He runs his finger across the coordinates. The numbers match, the terrain matches, the shadows match, but the field is new. It was not there 3 days ago, and now it has fighter aircraft on it. He writes his report and sends it up the chain, and by the time it reaches Luftwaffe headquarters, it is one of dozens of similar reports coming in from across the beachhead. Airfields are appearing in the Norman countryside like something conjured from the earth itself. Every morning the reconnaissance photographs show more of them. Every afternoon the fighter bombers flying from those fields are destroying German convoys, strafing German armor, and killing German soldiers on roads that had been safe for movement 48 hours earlier. The question the intelligence officer cannot answer, the question that German engineers and Luftwaffe planners and Organization TOT construction supervisors will wrestle with for the rest of the war, is simple. How are the Americans building airfields in 3 days? It is not a rhetorical question, it is an engineering question. A proper military airfield, by every standard the Germans knew, took months to construct. Some took years. The Luftwaffe had built its network of bases across occupied Europe using reinforced concrete, poured by thousands of laborers, hardened over weeks, finished with precision instruments. A single concrete runway of the type the Luftwaffe considered operational required surveying, grading, sub-base preparation, formwork, pouring, curing, and finishing. Even under ideal conditions, with unlimited labor, it was a project measured in months, not days. The great Luftwaffe bases of northern France, the ones from which Göring's bombers had struck England during the Blitz, had taken entire construction seasons to complete. The Americans were not building in months, they were not building in weeks. In several documented cases, American aviation engineer battalions put operational airstrips into service in less than 72 hours from the moment their men stepped off the landing craft. And the airfields worked. Fighters took off from them. Bombers landed on them. Fuel was stored beside them. Wounded men were evacuated from them. They were ugly. They were rough. They were nothing a German engineer would have signed his name to, and they were winning the war. To understand how this happened, we need to go back. Not to D-Day. Not even to the American entry into the war. We need to go back to a small town in North Carolina called Marston, to a steel engineer from Pittsburgh named Gerald Groylich, and to a generation of American young men who had spent the 1930s building roads and dams in a program designed not for war, but for economic survival. Because the answer to the German question, how are they building so fast, is not really an answer about engineering at all. It is an answer about a country, about what a country teaches its young men to do with their hands, and about what happens when those hands are given a war to build. But first, to appreciate why the German question carried such disbelief, you have to understand how the Germans built things. The Third Reich prided itself on engineering. German bridges, German autobahns, German factories, German fortifications, were the products of a tradition that valued permanence, precision, and scale. Fritz Todt, the engineer who gave his name to Organisation Todt, had overseen the construction of the Autobahn network beginning in the autumn of 1933, a project that employed hundreds of thousands of workers and produced some of the most impressive highway engineering in the world. When war came, Todt turned that same workforce to military purposes, and after Todt died in a plane crash in February 1942, Albert Speer inherited the empire and expanded it. By 1944, Organisation Todt was the largest construction organisation on Earth. It had built the Atlantic Wall, it had built the submarine pens, it had built underground factories. It thought in terms of reinforced concrete and forced labour and projects that took years to complete. In that world, an airfield was a permanent installation, like a railway station or a bridge. You did not throw one together in 3 days any more than you would throw together a cathedral in 3 days. The idea was absurd, and yet the Americans were doing it. That is what German engineers could not process, not because they lacked imagination, but because everything in their professional experience told them it should not work. Every like on this video helps the story of those men reach someone who has never heard it. That matters more than I can say. We have to start with a fact that should sound like a contradiction. The nation that would build airfields faster than any country in the history of warfare had almost no experience building military airfields when the war began. In 1939, the United States Army Air Corps had a problem. If the Air Corps was going to fight a war overseas, it would need airfields overseas, and not permanent bases of the kind that existed at Langley Field in Virginia or Hickam Field in Hawaii. It would need temporary fields, built fast, in jungles and deserts and on islands that did not have flat ground, paved roads, or reliable water supplies. The existing system for building such fields was the Army Corps of Engineers, which built things the way the Corps had always built things. Slowly, carefully, with civilian contractors, concrete mixers, and architectural drawings. A Corps of Engineers airfield was a beautiful thing. It was also a peacetime luxury that would take longer to build than the battle it was meant to support. General Henry Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Corps, understood this. In 1939, he negotiated with the Chief of Engineers for something new. A dedicated engineering unit that would belong to the Air Arm, move with the Air Arm, and build airfields at the speed the Air Arm required. The result was the Engineer Aviation Battalion. 27 officers and 761 enlisted men, organized to be capable of independently constructing an advanced airfield and all of its supporting facilities. Each battalion was equipped with 220 items of construction equipment and 146 vehicles. Diesel tractors with bulldozer blades, carry-all scrapers, motor graders, gasoline shovels, pneumatic rollers, rock crushers, pumps, draglines, concrete mixers, asphalt plants. It was in essence a complete road-building company, wrapped in a military uniform. The official history of the Army Air Forces in World War II notes something about these battalions that no German military planner could have predicted. It says, and I am paraphrasing from the official record, that only in the United States could engineers have planned on such a scale. The reason was that the expanding American Army included many men who already had construction and engineering experience in civilian life. That sentence, sitting quietly in an official government history, is the first half of the answer to the German question. Because between 1933 and 1942, a program called the Civilian Conservation Corps had put more than 3 million young American men to work building roads, bridges, trails, and dams across the United States. The CCC was Franklin Roosevelt's solution to the Depression, and it was, without anyone realizing it at the time, the largest military engineering training program in history. Those men built over 126,000 miles of roads and trails. They planted 3 billion trees. They constructed fire towers and fish hatcheries and park shelters. And along the way, they learned to operate heavy machinery, read topographic maps, grade terrain, pour foundations, clear timber, and work in organized crews under foremen who expected results by sundown. When the draft notices arrived in 1941 and 1942, Those same men walked into induction centers already knowing how to drive a bulldozer, run a grading crew, and lay a road across difficult ground. The army did not have to teach them. They had been doing it since they were 18 years old, for $3 a day and meals. Add to them the men who had built Hoover Dam, finished in 1936. The men who had dug the Lincoln Tunnel, completed in 1937. The men who had laid the Pennsylvania Turnpike, finished in 1940. The steel workers who had riveted the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. The farm boys from Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska who had been running the family tractor since they were 14. The auto mechanics who had rebuilt Model T engines on kitchen tables. The road crews who had paved the county highways of a nation that had more cars than any country on Earth and therefore more roads than any country on Earth. By 1940, the United States had a draft-age population with a depth of practical construction skill that no other nation could match. Not Britain, not the Soviet Union, certainly not Germany. When you put those men in uniform and gave them a bulldozer, the bulldozer was not a new tool. It was an old friend with a fresh coat of olive drab paint. The Germans had no equivalent reservoir. A German conscript of 1940 had grown up in a country whose roads were still being built by Fritz Tott's Autobahn project, begun in the autumn of 1933. German farms were still substantially horse-powered. The German construction workforce was skilled, deeply so, but its skill was concentrated in a professional class of engineers and tradesmen, not distributed across an entire generation of young men who had spent their teenage years operating heavy machinery for a government work program. The German system produced master craftsmen. The American system produced a country full of men who could do a decent job with any tool you handed them. This cultural depth of construction ability was the single most underrated American military advantage of the entire war, and it was paired with a machine that became the physical embodiment of that advantage. The Caterpillar D7 tractor. Military designation, tractor, heavy, M1. It was a diesel-powered, track-laying bulldozer weighing roughly 13 tons, built at the Caterpillar plant in Peoria, Illinois, and fitted with an angled dozer blade made by Letourneau or LaPlante Choate. The D7 could clear timber, grade a roadbed, push aside rubble, cut drainage ditches, and level a runway surface. Between 1940 and the end of the war, Caterpillar produced somewhere between 36,000 and 38,000 D7 tractors across several series, the 7M, the 3T, the 4T, and the 6T. The 4T was built specifically for the Army. The 6T was built for the Navy and the Seabees. Caterpillar ranked 44th among all United States corporations in the value of wartime military production contracts. The man who climbed into the seat of a D7 in 1942 usually already knew how it worked. He had driven something like it on a CCC project or a county road crew or a farm. The controls were familiar. The noise was familiar. The smell of diesel exhaust and churned earth was familiar. The Army had to teach him to build a runway. It did not have to teach him to drive. And that difference, between training a soldier to operate a machine and handing a machine to a man who already knew how to operate it, was worth months of time that the war did not have. This combination of cultural skill and industrial machinery was about to be paired with a third piece of the puzzle, a piece of technology that would turn the American advantage into something the German military had no answer for. In December 1939, the Army Air Corps observed that the British and French were experimenting with portable landing surfaces. Wire mesh grids, steel chevrons, anything that could be laid over soft ground to keep an airplane's wheels from sinking into mud. The Corps of Engineers was given the assignment. In May 1940, the project moved to the Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. A steel engineer named Gerald Greulich, working for the Carnegie Illinois Steel Company in Pittsburgh, helped design the solution alongside the Army's Engineer Board at Fort Belvoir. Greulich was a man whose professional life revolved around finding ways to make steel do more with less. The first prototypes, tested at Langley Field in the summer of 1940, were solid-ribbed steel sheets. They worked, but they were heavy, and they trapped water. Over the winter of 1940 to 1941, the engineers punched 87 holes in each panel. The perforations cut the weight by 17.5%, improved drainage, and gave aircraft tires better grip on the surface. The final product was deceptively simple. Each panel was 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, covering 12.5 square feet. It weighed 66.2 pounds. It was made of 10-gauge low-carbon steel. Along one long edge it had hooks. Along the other it had slots. 2 men could carry a panel. 1 man could connect it to the next panel in seconds. The hooks slid into the slots, the panels interlocked, and a runway grew across the ground like a steel carpet unrolling in real time. The first practical use in the field was at a place called Camp Mackle in North Carolina. The nearby railway stop was called Marston. In November 1941, an engineering crew laid a runway 150 feet wide and 3,000 feet long in 11 days. That included clearing 350 by 3,800 feet of ground, grading the surface, moving 50,000 cubic yards of earth, and laying every panel by hand. The name stuck. From that day until the end of the war and beyond, the portable steel runway panels were known as Marston Mat. Years later, in Vietnam, Air Force officers would have no idea what the name referred to. The bureaucrats had renamed it Pierced Steel Planking, or PSP. But the men who had used it in the war always called it Marston Mat. By December 1941, 2 factories had already produced 4 million square feet. By December 1942, 29 factories were in production. By the beginning of 1944, more than 180 million square feet had been shipped overseas, enough steel to surface 240 runways, each 150 feet wide and 5,000 feet long. By the end of the war, American industry had produced nearly 2 million tons of Marston Mat. That is enough steel to build 600 Liberty ships. A single Liberty ship could carry the mat for an entire 5,000-foot runway in its lower hold, in about 21% of its total payload capacity. That runway, once unloaded, could be laid on prepared ground and operational in 72 hours. 1 ship, 1 hold, 3 days, an airfield. Damaged panels could be repaired in the field. A single diesel-powered rehabilitation unit weighed 14 tons and could refurbish 250 panels per hour. In Australia, 1 airliftable plant restored 50 million square feet of mat during 1944 alone. The mat was not a disposable product. It was a reusable system, designed to be pulled up, stacked, shipped forward, and laid down again as the front moved. That is the number the Germans could not believe. 72 hours from ship to operational runway, and it is the number that changed the war. But the technology alone would have meant nothing without the men who used it, and the men who used it had to learn how to use it the hard way, in a theatre of war where everything went wrong before anything went right. November 8, 1942. North Africa. Operation Torch. The first major American amphibious invasion of the war. American forces hit the beaches of French Morocco and Algeria, and immediately discovered that having an air force was meaningless if you had nowhere to put it. The only hard surface runway in French Morocco was at Port Liauti, and the Allied air forces needed bases immediately. The aviation engineer battalions that should have been ashore building strips within hours were stuck on transport ships because the beach logistics had broken down. Trucks could not be unloaded. Equipment sat in cargo holds while men waded ashore with rifles. The carefully drawn plans dissolved in the surf. By December 1942, the rains had come to Tunisia, and the situation was desperate. Airfields that had worked on hard-packed sand in November were now rivers of mud. Fighters could not take off. Bombers could not land. The aluminum variant of Marston Mat, lighter and easier to ship, had been laid at several fields, but it buckled under heavy use, handling only about half as many loading cycles as the steel version before it needed to be recycled. Aircraft sank axle deep in clay that had turned to soup. The entire Allied air effort in northwest Africa was being strangled not by German fighters but by weather and mud. Brigadier General Donald Davison, the senior aviation engineer in North Africa, flew personally to a flat plateau between the Saharan and maritime Atlas Mountains, near a place called Telergma in Algeria. He walked the ground himself, on foot, studying the drainage, checking the soil composition, picking up handfuls of earth and squeezing them. He made a decision on the spot. Within hours, American Aviation Engineer Battalions began clearing the first strip, working alongside local laborers and using pneumatic tools that had finally been unloaded from the transports. On December 13, 1942, 11 days after Davison's reconnaissance flight, a B-26 medium bomber landed smoothly on Tlergma's packed runway. The completion of 3 additional strips on that plateau pulled the Allied bombers and most of the fighters off the soaked coastal fields and back into the fight. Then came Kasserine. February 1943. The worst defeat the United States Army suffered on the Western Front in the entire war. 6,500 men lost in 5 days. More than 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned. German panzers scattered American forces across 30 miles of Tunisian desert. Rommel's Africa Corps looked at the wreckage and concluded what their intelligence had been telling them. The Americans had money. They did not have soldiers. They had factories. They did not have fighters. They called the American army the Dollar Army, and it was not a compliment. Kasserine was humiliating. It was also, for the aviation engineers, a crucible. The lessons learned in those muddy, chaotic weeks in Tunisia, the fields that flooded, the equipment that could not be landed, the runways that crumbled under rain, would be refined, corrected, and applied with devastating efficiency 18 months later on a beach in Normandy. The Americans were not good at building airfields in combat conditions yet, but they were learning faster than anyone, including themselves, understood. If your father or grandfather served in the Army Air Forces, the Engineer Corps, or the Seabees in any theatre, I would consider it a privilege to read their story in the comments. Those details, the small, specific, personal things, matter more than any official archive. They are the actual record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the families that carry them. From Africa, the aviation engineers went to Sicily in July 1943, leapfrogging across the island building strips for the 12th Air Force. From Sicily they went to Italy, and in Italy they found the prize that would change the strategic air war over Europe, a flat agricultural plain in the region of Apulia, in southeastern Italy, centered on the city of Foggia. The Italian Regia Aeronautica had built roughly 33 airfields across the Foggia plain. When the British 8th Army captured the region in October 1943, the American engineers moved in and began repairing, expanding, and building. The work was enormous. Bomb craters had to be filled. Damaged runways had to be resurfaced with Marston mat and gravel. Drainage had to be restored. New taxiways and hardstands had to be graded for the heavy bombers that would be arriving within weeks. By mid-1944, approximately 24 airfields were operating in the Foggia complex. From those fields, the 15th Air Force sent B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers to strike the Romanian oil refineries at Ploiești, Austrian factories, and targets deep inside southern Germany and the Balkans. The Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group flew from Ramitelli. The 99th Bomb Group flew B-17s from Tortorella. The 483rd Bomb Group operated from Sturperone's 6,000-foot pierced steel planking runway. The Foggia complex put the war's most important strategic targets within range of Allied bombers, and it did so from airfields that had been in German hands months earlier. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, would later write in his memoir that he could see omens of the war's end almost every day in the blue southern sky, when the bombers of the American 15th Air Force crossed the Alps from their Italian bases to attack German industrial targets. Those Italian bases were the Foggia complex, built on ground the Germans had recently held, repaired with Marston mat and gravel by men who had poured concrete on dam projects and highway overpasses 5 years earlier. But Foggia was a rear area operation, built on captured Italian airfields, with time and relative safety to work. What happened next was something entirely different. What happened next was building airfields under enemy fire, on the wrong side of the hedgerows, while German artillery was still ranging the construction site and German infantry was fighting within earshot. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The plan drawn up by Brigadier General James Newman's 9th Engineer Command, with scheduling overseen by Colonel Herbert Ergot, the command's Chief of Staff, was the most aggressive airfield construction program ever attempted in the history of warfare. The schedule was precise to the day. 2 emergency landing strips on day itself, 1 behind each major beach, 2 refueling and rearming strips by D+3, 4 advanced landing grounds by D+8, 35 airfields total by D+40. An emergency landing strip was the simplest, fastest field to build. 1,000 meters of cleared, graded earth, wide enough for a light observation aircraft to land and take off. No fuel, no ammunition. Just a flat surface where a damaged plane could put down instead of crashing into the sea. A refueling and rearming strip was the next step up, capable of turning around fighters for another sortie with fresh fuel and bombs. An advanced landing ground was a real airfield, a 5,000-foot runway surfaced with Marston mat or Hessian or wire mesh, with dispersal areas, fuel dump points, a water supply, basic electrical service, and space for an entire fighter group to operate from. The men assigned to meet that schedule, 17,000 engineers in 16 aviation battalions, 3 airborne aviation battalions, and an aviation camouflage battalion, began landing on the beaches of Normandy in the first hours of the invasion. The 819th Engineer Aviation Battalion landed advance elements at H+3 hours on Omaha Beach. That means 3 hours after the first wave hit the sand, while the battle for the beach was still in progress, while men were still dying in the surf, while German machine guns were still firing from the bluffs. Engineers with bulldozers and grading equipment were coming ashore with orders to build a landing strip before dark. Their mission was to complete an emergency landing strip by nightfall on June 6 and an advanced landing ground by June 14. The Distinguished Unit Citation awarded to the 819th, preserved in the official records of the 9th Engineer Command, describes what happened next. It reads, and I am paraphrasing closely from the citation, that although the area was still partially occupied by the enemy, and at one time the engineering equipment was working within 200 yards of active German artillery emplacements, the initial assignment of constructing the emergency landing strip was completed in record time. 200 yards. That is the length of 2 football fields. The men of the 819th were grading earth and laying steel panels while German artillery was firing at them from a distance close enough to hear the gun crews shouting. They did not stop working. They built the strip. They would go on to build 10 advanced landing grounds and 14 supply and evacuation strips across France, Belgium, and Germany before the war ended. They rehabilitated 3 captured German airfields. They received the Presidential Distinguished Unit Citation, one of only a handful of engineering units in the entire war to be so honored. Behind Omaha Beach, the 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion built the first American airfield on the continent of Europe. It was designated a 1 at the village of Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. Construction began on June 7. By 1800 hours on June 8, roughly 60 hours after D-Day, the strip was operational. C-47 transport planes used it to evacuate wounded soldiers to England. On June 12, General Henry Arnold himself flew in to inspect the field. The 366th Fighter Group based its P-47 Thunderbolts there, beginning June 13, and immediately began flying ground attack missions against German armor and infantry in the hedgerows. The 834th also received the Presidential Distinguished Unit Citation. This is the airfield that showed up in Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs. This is the runway that was not there on Monday and was launching fighter bombers by Thursday. Across the beachhead, more strips went in every day. A 2 at Criqueville-en-Bessin, built by the 820th Engineer Aviation Battalion, operational June 10, 4 days after D-Day. A 3 at Cardenville, built by the 816th, operational the same day. A 10 at Carrington, built by the 826th after the town was captured, operational June 15, with a 5,000-foot runway surfaced in prefabricated Hessian, a burlap fabric soaked in bitumen that could be rolled out across packed earth like a carpet. A 11 at St. Lambert, built by the 832nd with a compressed earth and wire mesh runway. A 13 at Tours-en-Bessin, built by the 833rd and 846th Battalions working together, with 2 5,000-foot Marston mat runways that became one of the most heavily used airfields in the entire Normandy campaign. Lieutenant Colonel John Keane, commanding the 840th Engineer Aviation Battalion, opened his unit's official history with a sentence that captures what these men understood about themselves. He wrote, "Here then is the story, our story of the 1,000 days of our lives which we gave to our country. By June 19, 13 days after D-Day, 9th Tactical Air Command fighter-bomber groups were operational from Normandy soil. The aggregate number, recorded in the official history of the 9th Engineer Command, defines what happened next. By the end of the war in Europe, the 9th Engineer Command had built or rehabilitated 241 airfields across France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and Germany. 241. Most were completed in days. Many were abandoned within weeks as the front moved east, and new fields were built closer to the fighting. The 1st Engineer Aviation Brigade was rehabilitating Florennes Airfield in Belgium by September 9. They pushed into Luxembourg by September 13 and into Liège by September 19. The 2nd Engineer Aviation Brigade prepared fields around Melun and Coulommiers for medium bombers and actually skipped excellent sites at Romilly because Patton's Third Army was advancing so fast that the fields would have been too far behind the front to be useful by the time they were finished. The American Army was advancing faster than its own engineers could build airfields. The engineers were the fastest military construction force on Earth, and they could not keep up with Patton. Consider for a moment what that means in practice. A fighter group needs to be within roughly 150 miles of the front to provide effective tactical air support. 150 miles is 15 minutes of flight time for a P-47 at cruise speed. Every day the front advanced, the fighters had to move forward too, or their response time stretched beyond the point of usefulness. The American solution was simple and brutal. Build a field, use it. Advance. Abandon it. Build another. The Marston mat was pulled up, stacked on flatbed trucks, driven down roads that were themselves being built by combat engineers, and laid down again in a new pasture closer to the fighting. The entire airfield infrastructure of the Allied tactical air forces in France was, in effect, mobile. It walked eastward with the armies, and it walked at a pace no other military in history had attempted. In the Pacific, the same phenomenon was playing out on coral atolls and volcanic islands, with the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, performing feats that would have been considered physically impossible by any pre-war engineering standard. The Seabees were the creation of Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, the chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks. On January 5, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, Moriel secured authority to organize naval construction battalions, the name quickly shortened to CB, then written as Seabees. Like the Army's aviation engineers, the Seabees drew from the same deep pool of American construction talent: steelworkers, electricians, heavy equipment operators, carpenters, plumbers, and welders, many of them older than the typical draftee, men in their 30s and 40s who had been building things professionally for decades. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese had begun an airfield at Lunga Point. The 1st Marine Division seized it on August 7, 1942, and immediately resumed construction using captured Japanese equipment. The Marine 1st Engineer Battalion worked around the clock. On August 20, 13 days after the landing, the 1st Marine fighters and dive bombers landed on the strip. It was renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion arrived on September 1 and surfaced the runway with Marston mat while Japanese bombers attacked the field daily and Japanese warships shelled it nightly. The Seabees built special trucks loaded with steel planking and crushed coral that could race to bomb craters and fill them in minutes. After the night of October 13 to 14, when 2 Japanese battleships fired more than 900 14-inch shells into Henderson Field in 83 minutes, the Seabees patched the craters and had the field operational again within hours. On Tinian, Marines landed on July 24, 1944. The 18th and 121st Naval Construction Battalions came ashore with the assault troops. By the evening of July 27, 3 days after the landings, the 121st had filled the bomb craters on Ouchy Point Airfield and opened a 2,500-foot strip. The next day they had it back to its full 4,700 feet. On July 29, a P-47 landed and took off. The 6th Naval Construction Brigade, 12 battalions under Captain Paul Halloran, later promoted to Commodore for his work in the Pacific, then built North Field, with 4 8,500-foot parallel runways, and West Field, with 2 more. They moved close to 1 million cubic yards of coral and logged over 900,000 truck miles. North Field became the largest airfield in the world. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay took off from North Field and dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a B-29 named Boxcar took off from the same field and dropped the second on Nagasaki. The runways they rolled down were built by welders from Oakland and construction workers from Brooklyn and farm boys from Missouri, who had been crushing coral in tropical heat 6 months earlier. On Iwo Jima, the 31st and 133rd Naval Construction Battalions landed with the Marines on February 19, 1945, with the 62nd arriving days later. The 133rd suffered the highest casualties of any Seabee unit in the entire war. By February 26, 7 days after the landing, South Field was usable for observation aircraft while the battle still raged across the island. On March 4, a damaged B-29 called Dynamite made the first emergency B-29 landing on Iwo Jima. By July 7, the first B-29 runway at Central Field was paved to 8,500 feet. That same day, 102 returning B-29s landed on it, validating every drop of blood the Seabees and Marines had shed to take the island. On Okinawa, both Yontan and Kadena airfields were captured largely intact on L-Day, April 1, 1945. Kadena was usable for emergency landings that same day. Marine observation aircraft came ashore the next morning. By April 4, just 3 days after the landings, Marine fighters of Marine Air Group 31 were flying combat missions from Yontan. On Iwo Jima, a small island west of Okinawa, the 805th Engineer Aviation Battalion completed a 7,000-foot runway on August 10, 1945. It was the first all-American-built runway in the Ryukyu Islands. 9 days later, 2 white-painted Japanese Betty bombers carrying the Japanese surrender delegation landed on that strip, the first step in the process that ended the war. The runway they touched down on had been built by aviation engineers in the time it would have taken Organization TOT to pour the forms for a single section of concrete. On Oe Island, off the coast of Biak in New Guinea, an entire airfield was operational in less than 2 weeks after the engineers landed. The construction followed a pattern that repeated across the Pacific. Clear the ground, grade the surface, lay the mat, fly, move on. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific Theater alone had 31 Engineer Aviation Battalions, 6 Airborne Aviation Battalions, and 2 Engineer Aviation Regimental Headquarters in action. The retaking of Leyte in the Philippines required 15 EABs, plus 3 Naval Construction Battalions, 2 port repair groups, and 7 dump truck companies, a total of over 21,000 engineer soldiers committed to a single island campaign. The scale was staggering, and the speed was relentless. In New Guinea, in September 1943, an aviation engineer named Lieutenant Everett Fraser performed one of the war's most extraordinary individual feats. He travelled behind Japanese lines with an Australian officer and native porters to survey a potential airfield site at Tsili Tsili, the staging base that would make the next leap forward possible. Based on his report, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped into the Nadzab area on September 5, 1943. The next day, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Woodbury's 871st Airborne Engineer Aviation Battalion was air-landed by C-47 transport, bringing in small portable bulldozers and graders. Within days, the strips they built were receiving hundreds of transport sorties, carrying the Australian 7th Division forward to the fight for Ley. The speed of these constructions, measured against what any other nation was doing, was not an incremental advantage, it was a categorical difference. And this is the part of the story that brings us to what was happening on the other side. Because while the Americans were laying steel mat across the mud of Normandy and the coral of the Pacific, the Germans were doing something that explains, more clearly than any battle ever could, why they lost the air war. They were pouring concrete. The German approach to airfield construction was the mirror image of the American one. The Luftwaffe had built its pre-war network of bases using reinforced concrete runways arranged in triangular patterns, each runway roughly 1,200 meters long, with paved hardstands, permanent hangars with concrete aprons, brick barracks, and full workshop complexes. A typical Luftwaffe base had illuminated runways, compass swing pads, machine gun ranges, and dedicated servicing facilities. It was designed to last for decades. It was a thing of permanence and precision. It was, on its own terms, magnificent. The problem was that permanence takes time, and by 1944, the Luftwaffe did not have time. The construction units that had built those bases were originally Luftwaffe battalions staffed with Reichsarbeitsdienst labor service workers and civilian contractors. From 1938, they were converted into formal Luftwaffe construction companies and battalions. By 1941, they were organized into regiments. But in 1944, in a decision that tells the entire story in a single administrative order, most Luftwaffe construction battalions were absorbed into Organization TOT, Albert Speer's vast construction empire. Only 14 battalions remained under direct Luftwaffe control. Organization TOT was extraordinarily capable. Between August 1940 and May 1944, it poured approximately 17 million cubic meters of concrete into the Atlantic Wall, the chain of coastal fortifications running from Norway to Spain. It built submarine bunker pens at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient and Brest with walls so thick that no Allied bomb could penetrate them. But Organization TOT was a permanence machine, not a speed machine, and by 1944, it was something worse. It was a forced labor machine. By 1943, Organization TOT employed more than 1 million workers, of whom only about 10% were Germans in supervisory roles. The rest were forced laborers from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. The German doctrinal philosophy was concrete, permanent, and grand. The American doctrinal philosophy was steel mat, expedient, and now. The Germans built airfields that would last 50 years. The Americans built airfields that would last 60 days, and then tore them up, loaded the mat onto trucks, drove it 50 miles east, and built a new one. The American system accepted an ugly airfield in 3 days over a beautiful one in 3 months. The American system was designed for a war that moved. The German system was designed for a war that stayed. The typology of American expedient airfields tells the story better than any doctrinal manual could. An emergency landing strip was a cleared patch of earth, usable for observation planes and crash landings. A refueling and rearming strip could turn a fighter around with fresh fuel and a new bomb load. An advanced landing ground was a real base. 5,000 feet of runway surfaced in Marston mat or prefabricated Hessian or wire mesh, with dispersal points, fuel storage, water supply, and room for a full fighter group. Each type was faster and cheaper to build than a German concrete runway section. Each type was expendable. Each type could be replaced by the next one, 50 miles closer to the enemy, built on ground that had been farmland that morning. The surfacing options alone reveal the American mentality. Steel Marston mat for heavy use. Prefabricated Hessian, a burlap fabric soaked in bitumen, for lighter traffic. Square mesh track, a British wire mesh product when shipping space was tight. Compressed earth and crushed coral when nothing else was available. The Americans would surface a runway with whatever they had, as long as it kept an airplane's wheels from sinking. The German engineer who built a concrete runway at a Luftwaffe base near Templin would not have recognized any of these as a legitimate building material, but the P-47 Thunderbolts that took off from them did not care what the runway was made of. They cared that it was there. And the Germans knew their system was failing, not from doctrine, not from intelligence reports. They knew it from the sky above their heads. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, wrote a report on June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, that reads, 80 years later, almost like a surrender document. He described the immensely powerful, at times overwhelming superiority of the enemy air force. He wrote that the enemy had total command of the air over the battle area up to roughly 100 kilometers behind the front. He wrote that during the day, Practically all German traffic on roads, tracks, and in open country was pinned down by powerful fighter-bomber formations, and that the movement of German troops on the battlefield was almost completely paralyzed, while the enemy could maneuver freely. Rommel had known this feeling before. 2 years earlier, during the North African campaign, he had written in his journal that anyone who has to fight against an enemy in complete command of the air fights like a savage against modern European troops with the same chances of success. Rommel understood air power. He had fought under Allied air superiority in the desert for 2 years. What he had never encountered before Normandy was an enemy whose air bases moved with the speed of the ground offensive they supported. The Luftwaffe's concrete fields were permanent, beautiful, and predictable. The American Marston mat strips behind the Normandy beachhead were temporary, rough, and impossible to anticipate, because they did not exist until 72 hours before the first sortie flew from them. You could not bomb an airfield that had not been built yet. You could not plan around an airbase that was a cow pasture at the beginning of the week. The German reconnaissance system, built to track fixed installations, had no category for an airfield that appeared, operated for 6 weeks, and then vanished. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who replaced Rommel after Rommel was wounded in a strafing attack, wrote to Hitler in July 1944 with even less hope. He said that in the face of total enemy air superiority, the German army could adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air except to retreat from the battlefield. Kluge committed suicide on August 19, 1944. General Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, the man responsible for every Luftwaffe fighter in the sky, wrote in his memoir that from the very first moment of the invasion, the Allies had absolute air supremacy. He described how wherever German fighters appeared, the Americans attacked them, how the Americans went over to low-level attacks on German airfields, and how nowhere were the Germans safe. They had to hide on their own bases. During takeoff, during assembly, during climb, during approach to the bombers, during the flight home, during landing, and even after landing, the American fighters attacked with overwhelming superiority. Galland was describing the effect of an air force that could operate from forward bases built in 3 days. His own Luftwaffe was flying from concrete fields that had taken months to build, and that were now being systematically destroyed by the very aircraft taking off from the Marston mat strips his construction system could never replicate. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, gave a post-war account of Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy on July 25, 1944. His description of what the bombing did to his division is one of the most devastating first-hand accounts of air power in the entire war record. He said the bomb carpets rolled toward his positions. Artillery emplacements were wiped out. Tanks were overturned and buried. Infantry positions were flattened. All roads and tracks were destroyed. By midday, he said, the entire area resembled a moon landscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut. No command was possible. The shock effect on the troops was beyond description. The aircraft that delivered those bomb carpets were flying from fields that American engineers had built in the Norman countryside in the weeks following D-Day. Fields designated A1 and A6 and A10 and A13. Fields that had been cattle pastures in May. Lieutenant General Bodo Zimmermann, the chief operations officer of the German command in the West, wrote that on D-Day itself, the whole area through which German divisions had to march was being most intensively patrolled by Allied air forces. No road movement by day was possible under the air umbrella, which reached from Normandy all the way back to Paris. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, wrote that Allied air forces found worthwhile targets throughout his entire offensive zone. Bomb carpets were laid on roads and railways behind the front. His already inadequate supply system was throttled. The mobility of his forces decreased steadily and rapidly. Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, in his post-war study of armoured warfare, wrote what amounts to the epitaph of the German air war. He said the Ardennes battle drives home the lesson that a large-scale offensive by massed armour has no hope of success against an enemy who enjoys supreme command of the air. Supreme command of the air. That is what 2 million tons of Marston mat had purchased. Not air superiority measured in aircraft numbers or pilot training hours or engine horsepower, superiority measured in proximity. The American Air Force was always close. It was always close because it could always move forward. It could always move forward because a battalion of former road builders and dam workers and farm boys could pull up a runway, load it onto trucks, and lay it down again 50 miles closer to the enemy in 72 hours. The airfield was not a permanent structure. It was a tool. And like every American tool, it went where the work was. So here is the answer to the question that the Luftwaffe intelligence officer could not answer when he looked at the reconnaissance photographs from Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. They were building with a 10-foot steel panel, developed with the help of a Pittsburgh engineer named Gerald Groylich, manufactured in 29 factories, shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty shipholds, and laid on packed earth by men who had learned to grade roads and operate bulldozers in CCC camps during the Great Depression. They were building with Caterpillar D, 7 tractors driven by sergeants who had been driving tractors since they were boys. They were building with a philosophy that said, an airfield did not need to be beautiful. It did not need to last 20 years. It needed to last long enough for a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts to fly 15 minutes to the German lines, drop their bombs, and come back to rearm. 60 days. That was the designed life of an advanced landing ground. 60 days, and then you tore it up and built the next one. The Germans could not replicate this. Not because their engineers were less capable. German engineering was extraordinary, and Organization TOT's 17 million cubic meters of Atlantic Wall concrete was a construction achievement no Allied force matched. The problem was not skill, it was philosophy. The Germans were building for centuries. The Americans were building for the next sortie. Every name in this story is real. Every date is documented. The 819th Engineer Aviation Battalion was real. The 834th was real. Gerald Groylich was real. Donald Davison was real. James Newman and Herbert Ergot were real. Captain Paul Halloran was real. Lieutenant Everett Fraser, who surveyed the staging airfield at Tsili Tsili behind Japanese lines, was real. The Seabees of the 133rd Naval Construction Battalion, who took the highest casualties of any Seabee unit in the war while building on Iwo Jima, were real. The men of the 803rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, who fought as infantry on Bataan and Corregidor and were overrun in May 1942 after keeping Kindley Field operational for roughly 2 months under near-constant shelling, were real. The official history records that a few of them lived to tell the story. Most of their names are not in the history books. Most of them came home after the war and went back to operating bulldozers, grading roads, welding steel, and farming, and never told anyone what they had done. They were not combat heroes in the way the word is usually understood. They did not charge machine gun nests. They did not lead bayonet assaults. They graded earth. They laid steel panels. They filled bomb craters at 3 in the morning while shells fell around them. They built things. And the things they built allowed the men who did charge machine gun nests to be supported by an air force that was never more than 15 minutes away, flying from a runway that had not existed the week before. The German commanders who wrote their memoirs after the war described Allied air power as though it were weather, something unavoidable and elemental. They almost never mentioned the airfields. They talked about the bombs that fell on their columns and the fighters that strafed their convoys, but they rarely asked the question that mattered most. Where did those planes come from? They came from fields that were not there last week. They came from runways made of steel panels developed in Pittsburgh and laid on French farmland by men from Illinois and Texas and New Jersey who had built highways for $3 a day. They came from coral strips on Pacific Islands, crushed and graded and covered with mat by Seabees who could patch bomb craters faster than the enemy could make them. They came from the deep, quiet, unshakable competence of a country that had spent a decade teaching its young men to build and then asked them to build the same things in a war zone. And they did, every time, without fail, under fire, in 3 days, with steel panels and bulldozers, and the certainty that the job in front of them was just another job, and that they were the ones who were going to finish it. 241 airfields built by one engineer command in one theatre, thousands more across the Pacific. Nearly 2 million tons of steel pressed into panels with 87 holes punched through each one. The runways are all gone now. The mat was pulled up and melted down or turned into fences and barn floors across Normandy and the Pacific Islands. The fields returned to pasture. Nothing remains except the photographs, the unit citations, and the words of the men who had to fight against what those airfields made possible. And those words, written in field reports and memoirs and interrogation transcripts, all say the same thing in different ways. We could not move. We could not fight. The air was everywhere, because the airfields were everywhere, because the Americans could build them faster than we could destroy them. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men who did extraordinary things not because anyone ordered them to, but because the work needed doing, and they were the ones standing there with a wrench in one hand and a shovel in the other. And the things they built, those rough, temporary, 60-day airfields made of steel panels and packed earth, won the air war, not through brilliance and not through luck, but through the simple, relentless, unanswerable fact that they existed. 3 days after the ground was cleared, they existed, and from them, the sky belonged to the men who built them.